I'm not sure why you'd want to start from sort of 3 meters away, shout, lift your arms over your head and then start running. I'm coming to get you sort of thing and expect that to be successful. Hi, my name is Andy Fisher. I am a 6th Dan in Kendo and former member and captain of the British national Kendo team. Today, I'm going to be reacting to Ghost of Tsushima. Okay, so this is obviously the different stances that are available. This is called stone stance. Okay, so I'm not sure about his hat there, but the stance itself is quite similar to one that we have in Kendo. Actually, we don't tend to use it so much in actual combat situations in Kendo. We use it in the kata, which are the preset forms called hasso no kamae. It tends to feature a lot in Japanese swordsmanship. You see it in a lot of different styles as well. It's quite archetypal, really. Reasonably useful stance, but like I say, we don't tend to use it in genuine combat style situations because it's not all that useful. Generally, you want to kind of put the sword between you and you and the bad guy. So, right, so what's this one? Water stance. This one, he seems to be holding the sword over his head with one hand. I can't imagine using a Japanese sword like this, to be honest. They're quite heavy and they're designed to be used with 2 hands. It looks cool, of course. From a practical point of view, I don't see myself trying to fight using this. Okay, next one, wind stance. It's another one-handed one. And he was throwing some kicks out there as well. So I'm not sure you want to be trying to kick people that are trying to cut you with swords. And now we're at moon stance. This is a quite interesting stance, shall we say? This seems to be the sort of the least likely thing I'd do in a sword fight with a Japanese sword. For me, I'd want to try and keep the sword between me and the other person. I want to take the quickest route to striking them or cutting them with the sword. Whereas if I hold it all the way back here, it's got such a long way to travel to make any sort of strikes. And I saw in the sort of little box in the corner there, he was making some kicks and spinning around and stuff like that. Doesn't strike me as a super practical way of fighting. It looks cool in a video game, of course. I think out of all of these stances, all but one of them were holding the sword with one hand. And I know he was sometimes grabbing it with 2 hands to make cuts, but a lot of the time he's making cuts with one hand. It's just not the most efficient way of using the Japanese sword. The way the Japanese sword is made, it's curved in this way, and you really want to be striking with the top end of the sword, the top third of the blade. I'd like to see him holding the sword out in front of him in a more sort of practical fighting stance, to be honest. Obviously, he starts the encounter with the sword sheathed in the saya, or the scabbard. There's another Japanese sword form called batto jutsu, which is where you unsheath and strike at the same time. In Kendo, we exclusively use the sword whilst it's already drawn. And I think for the most part, these sort of encounters, I think a better idea would be, if you know you're going to start sword fighting, would be to get your sword out first before you start fighting. But what I do really like about this interpretation of this sort of standoff situation is that sort of tension that's created. And that's something that's very much echoed in Kendo, where you have this kind of standoff situation where the tension's building. It's almost like a scene from the Wild West where the 2 cowboys are hovering over their revolvers ready to draw at any second. We definitely have that concept in Kendo as well. Even though the swords aren't sheathed, the swords are crossed, but it's who's going to make the first move, whilst that it's like a pot about to boil over. Who's going to make that first move and show their ability, show their intention. That's going to be the moment that decides the victory or defeat, of course. Oh, brilliant. I like how he's going after several of them as well. They all keep coming at him. So yeah, I like that. I like how he's, you get that build-up of pressure there, and then something happens, bam, it all kicks off, shall we say. And then they keep coming at him. He turns around and deals with them. That's all cool. Like I said before, though, I'm not so keen on this sort of swinging the sword around with one hand. I know it looks cool. It looks flashy and stuff. It's great for a video game, of course, which is what this is. But realistically, obviously, after the first one, yeah, you might just use one hand to draw the sword and make your first cut, but then you're going to get your second hand back on the sword, and you're going to be making your next cuts with both hands on the sword. Like I said, it's really important when you're swinging a Japanese sword that you're transferring the power to the tip of the blade properly by using the whole length of it. So that means you've got to use your left hand at the bottom of it to transfer that power properly right up to the top. Otherwise, you're not going to be cutting properly. The thing's heavy. You're not going to swing it so fast, and you could really hurt you. I reckon you could really hurt your wrist doing that as well. And they're not light things. Okay, this guy's got 2 swords. Okay, that was quite nice. I'm just gonna pause that quickly because the chap with 2 swords there jumps in with his sort of lunge, and we see a technique from our protagonist here that is very, very similar to something that we have in Kendo. This kind of deflection. We have a very similar one called suriage, where you would kind of, as the sword comes in, you kind of sweep it upwards and out, and then make a chance for you to strike as well, which is exactly what he's done. See, these cuts as well with the 2 hands, these are looking much more appropriate, much more viable. I particularly like the last one after he makes a series, and the last one he puts his whole body into it with a large stamp as he sort of twists his body into it. This is quite similar to what we do in Kendo as well. We have this concept of what's called Fumikomi. It's the kind of stamping action as you make a strike, and it's to help you unify your body to move together with the sword so that the strike becomes powerful and of course valid. Yeah, and there we see that suriage again, and this looks quite good as well, where he goes to this sort of kasumi no kamae, where they sort of hold the sword sort of this way, and then he makes these sort of thrusts, these stabs. I think that would be a very effective way of fighting. As I said before, it kind of gets the sword between you and the other person, which I definitely think is a smarter way of fighting. I'm not sure about the rolling around, of course. I'm not sure you can manage that with all that armor on and a bow stuck to your back, but sort of having looked at that, there's quite a few moves there that are very, very similar to moves that we have in Kendo. Like I say, this sort of suriage type deflection where you sweep upwards. Nice strikes as well with the 2-handed cuts. I really like those, especially the ones, like I say, where he's using his body more, using his feet as well to kind of unify the whole thing together. And less so when he started sort of swinging it around with one hand and spinning around and stuff like that. I think he's going to struggle there, especially if some of those guys had sort of spears, which, you know, you don't want to be jumping and spinning around against spears, I don't think. Yeah, quite liked all that. I liked the use of what we would call tai sabaki, which is where you move your body out of the way. Of course, the best type of defense is not to be there when the sword comes in. Not sure about the rolling around on the ground. I'm not sure that's super effective, but otherwise, I thought that was quite a good little sort of aspect of combat there. So there he goes into a stance that's similar, and I think a version of a stance that we do actually use in Kendo, called Jodan no Kamae. It's where the sword's held over the head. His was slightly sort of to the side, but I think that's just a different version of it. It's the same sort of principle. He really affects his opponents with a sort of change in his spirit, his ki. It's almost emanating from him and freezing them where they sort of stand, ready for him to go and sort of cut them down. This is something that we actually do have in Kendo, funnily enough. Obviously, it's not as obvious as this, where somebody just kind of goes like this and light shines from or anything like that. It's not like that, but you do find yourselves in situations where you're so sort of overcome by the intention of the opponent that you sort of freeze in place and are unable momentarily, honestly, for a split second, to sort of react to their attacks, and of course a split second's all they need. So it kind of translates well to that. He was making the strikes again with the nice 2-handed strikes. I liked how he used consecutive strikes where he'd cut to the legs, and then as the person fell down, he sort of brought it around and made the cut over again. As he makes these cuts, he's not just cutting with his hands here. He seems to be actually turning his hips and his shoulders as he cuts as well. So he gets the correct, what we call hasuji. That's the line of the blade. So we make sure that we're actually cutting with the sharpest part of the blade, and so that the cuts are not just powerful, but are actually efficient and effective at actually slicing the areas we want to slice, you know? I'm not sure about the tassel on the end of the sword. I think that would get in the way. Yeah, so this is much better. So then I'm just going to hit pause on that there. He started flailing around with one hand, and of course the guy's got a shield. He's just sort of batting it off very, very easily. Well, suddenly he sort of started reverting to more sort of useful attacks, where he's actually using the sword properly with some actual power behind it. He was able to land some successful blows. This is interesting. So this point here, they sort of lock together. This is something that looks like you would only see in the movies, but actually in Kendo it happens an awful lot because both people might make a strike, or one person makes a strike and the other person blocks. And then you sort of end up at this really close distance because you're sort of throwing yourself in and the swords sort of lock together. So at that point, you have to try and make another chance, another opportunity to make a strike or a cut from that position where the tsuba, that's the handguards on the swords, are locked together. What's really interesting about that is it's obviously this game is set in a period of history where the invaders came from Mongolia, and they got a very different type of sword fighting. They've got very different equipment. So for the sort of Japanese people, it would have been unusual to fight against, I expect. And I think it would be something very difficult to deal with as well. Shields are quite a difficult conundrum, really, for a Japanese swordsman. What I'd be looking for, and what we saw in the game that worked really quite well, are sort of effective counterattacks rather than trying to just bash through the shield. We saw that Suriage again, where he sort of deflected upwards and then went to make a strike. And what I really liked, again, we saw that other one, the Ukenagashi, where he sort of came with a downward strike and he sort of deflected it off as he moved and made a return strike there. I think that's the most effective way to deal with that. And then the other thing that I really liked as well was when the opponent swapped over to the spear or the halberd. The player was doing a really good job of controlling the distance. It's one of the things that's really important in Kendo. In Kendo, we limit the area of the sword that you're allowed to strike with. Anything below the top third of the blade doesn't count as a point. So if you make a strike with the sort of area of the blade near the hands, it doesn't count because it's an inefficient area to strike with. So because we're restricted in that way, we take a lot of care about what distance we are using. Are we at the right distance to make our strikes? Now, if you're against somebody that's got a spear or something that's very long like that, the thing about a spear, of course, is that the sharp bit's quite short compared to the size of the handle. So if you can use your distance well, get past that dangerous end, then you're going to put yourself at an advantage, whereas normally you'd probably be at a disadvantage if you were stood further away. I like his hat. That's cool. Not sure you could see so well out of it though. We got another demonstration of that wonderful Suriage waza and the Ukenagashi counters, where you sort of deflect and make the strike. Again, I like that sort of thrusting strikes. I think they're very, very effective. And we saw a really good example of the Tsubazeriai position, where the two swords clash and they come together and they lock at the handguards, the tsuba. That's the round handguard that's affixed to a Japanese sword. Very, very realistic. It's something that definitely happens a lot. Extremely dangerous situation with real swords, of course. One thing I was a little bit unsure about was the sort of posturing at the beginning. And it looks cool and everything. I get it's for a video game, but sort of, especially from the opponent's point, where he sort of stood there holding his hand over the sword whilst they were about sort of 5 meters apart. If it was me, I think I'd just whip the sword out and be like, right, let's go. What a beautiful setting for a duel. I'm not sure why you'd want to start from sort of 3 meters away, shout, lift your arms over your head and then start running. I'm coming to get you, sort of thing, and expect that to be successful. Making strikes from overhead it can be certainly effective. What you don't want to do though is once the sword's over your head, you don't want to let it drop down even further, because you've got to then make all the effort to bring it back again. From here, it wants to be at a point where you're able to instantly from there, bam, bring it straight down this way. Whereas what this guy was doing, he had it almost behind his head this way, so he's going to have to really bring it down. It's going to be much, much slower, added to the fact that he sort of announced that he was coming to strike and then sort of had a little jog over as he did it. Not a super intelligent move in my book. Similarly, he sort of did this thing a lot where he'd sort of spin around on the ground before making an upward strike. That sort of spin around on the ground seemed totally redundant. I don't see how that would benefit the cut at all. There was some nice moves that we saw. The opponent sort of lunged forward a lot with some sort of small slashes, repetitive. I quite like that. I thought that could be quite effective. I don't think they'd do a massive amount of damage, but they'd certainly be unpleasant if you found yourself on the wrong end of it. It's an absolutely incredible representation and rendition of Japan. I spent many years in Japan, and it really does represent it very, very well. It's such a beautiful game in that respect. The representation of the sword fighting, of course, it's very theatrical, it's very cinematic, which is what you would expect from any portrayal of samurai sword fights in popular culture. But there are elements of Kendo or moves that we have in Kendo, or concepts that we have in Kendo, that can be seen even in this game, despite it being very cinematic. And I really like that. I think that's really nice. I think it helps to give it a feel of authenticity, and it really brings something that I think is really quite special to the combat and to the game as a whole.
And if you like that video, why not check out our sword expert reacting to fight scenes from Netflix The Witcher? And for more experts reacting, stick with IGN.